Hello, today we're going to talk about fractions and decimals. And we will start with our math message. So on your paper for your notes, I want you to write the following fractions as decimals. See if you can figure that out. We've got 1/10. Write that as a decimal. 32 hundredths. 7 tenths. And 9 hundredths. Now, one of the things that might help you is to look very far down at the bottom of the screen there. And what I've done is I've placed ones, a decimal point, tenths, hundredths, and thousandths in word form to get you to think about where you might put your numbers when you look at the fractions as a decimal. So if I were going to write 1/10, I would have a 1 in the tenths place. My decimal point would remain in the same place. I don't have a whole number, so I'm going to put a 0 there. I don't have any hundredths. I don't have any thousandths. So I would write 1/10 as 0 and 1/10 as a decimal. If we take a look at 32 hundredths, again, we're going to think about how does that sound when we say it out loud. 32 hundredths. So hundredths is the last word that I say. So I need to have my 2 in the hundredths place, 3 in the tenths place, my decimal point, and my 0 because I don't, again, have a whole number. So we have 32 hundredths as a fraction, and then we have 0 and 32 hundredths as a decimal. So be thinking about 7 tenths. It should be very similar to the 1/10 that we just did a few minutes ago. So 7 tenths, I'm going to put the 7 in the tenths place, put my decimal point, put my 0 because I don't have a whole number, and there is 0 and 7 tenths as a decimal. And now we're going to move on to 9 hundredths. And once again, hundredths is the last thing that you hear, so that 9 needs to be in that place. So that means I don't have any tenths, so I'm going to place a 0. I've got my decimal point and 0 wholes. So this is how we would write 9 hundredths as a decimal. It would say 0 and 9 hundredths. Some of the tools that we are going to be using in class for you to figure out decimals and fractions are base 10 grids. And I know this isn't a very good picture. Yours will be much better out of your book. But up at the top, we have a grid that if we were going to count all of those small squares, there would be 100 of those squares. Okay, so we call that a 100 grid. It's a base 10 grid, but there's 100 pieces. At the bottom, you can't see the lines very well, but they're divided into strips, and there are 10 strips. Okay, so think of that as our rods when we use our base 10 blocks. And if we think about our grid at the top, that would be our cubes with our base 10 blocks. So you would need 100 cubes to cover that grid. You would need 10 rods to cover the grid at the bottom. Remove that out of the way. So here's a better picture of that 100 grid. That's what it looks like. I'm going to scoot that over, and then we've got our grid with our rods, so to speak. So that one has some shading, as you can see. So if I were going to look at that grid, I'm going to get rid of this one for right now. I have 3 rods that would be shaded. So that means 3 out of 10. So think about that. 3 out of 10. I could write that as a fraction. 3 tenths. And then if I need to turn that into a decimal, it would be 0 and 3/10. Okay, so let's take a look at some more that we can work through here. So this grid has cubes in it, right? There's 100 little squares. And if we were going to try to figure out a fraction, we could count all of those squares, or if you know that there are 10 in each column, this right here would be 10, 20, 30, and then I could count 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37. So this would be 37 out of 100, or 37 hundredths as a fraction. And as a decimal, it would look like this. Okay, so that's our first example. And we're going to move those out of the way. And let's take a look at some more. If I can get this to open up for me. Okay, so these are already done for us. It's just showing you a picture. Our first picture is showing that I have 1, 2, 3/10 shaded in. This is my fraction, and this is how I would write my decimal, 0 and 3/10. If we move over to this grid, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shaded in. So that's where I get 5/10. And in decimal form, we would write that as 0 and 5/10. And then over here on our last one, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of those shaded in. So 10 out of 10. We can see that that is one whole, because the whole thing is shaded in. Let's move that out of the way. Here we've got, if I can get that to open, there we go. We've got a grid with our small squares. So we know there's 100 of them. If we count them, we can see that we have 4 out of 100. So 4 hundredths. And when we write that as a decimal, it's going to be 0 and 4 hundredths. Make sure you put that in the hundredths place, not the tenths place. Okay? That's that one. We take this one. Okay, and in this one, we're going to count the columns because we know there's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and there's 2 there, so 52, 54, 56, 58. So we have 58 out of 100, or 0 and 58 hundredths. Okay, this one, again, I'm going to count by tens because I see a lot of columns filled in. So I'm going to go 1, so okay, let's start that with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and I can see that I'm only missing 1 here, so that's going to be 79 out of 100, or 79 hundredths, and my decimal would be 0 and 79 hundredths. Okay, so here on the screen, you're going to see some things in your book where you are going to have to take a fraction and change it to a decimal. And then sometimes you're going to have a decimal that you'll have to change to a fraction. So I've done some of those here for you that we can look at. So our first one, we have 3/10, and of course that's going to equal 0 and 3/10 as a decimal. Then we have 3/4. Now this one's a little bit different because it's got 4 as our denominator. So when we think about how does that work, well, there's a couple of ways that we could think about that. We could think about that as a square, that if I divide that into 4 parts, right, we would have 3 of those parts would be shaded to give us 75, right? When I think fourths, I always think of money, so I think of quarters, right? If this were a hundreds grid, I would know that there was 25 squares in each section of this picture, because 25 plus 25 plus 25 equals 75. So think money anytime that you have 4 as a denominator, and think about quarters. That will help you. All right, with that one. So as we go down, we've got 0 and 8/10 this time as a decimal. We're going to change that into a fraction. So you need to think when you say that out loud, you're saying tenths. So that means 10 is going to be your denominator. So you're going to have 8/10 or 8/10. And then as we move down to this one, we have 0 and 20/100ths. So again, that means I'm going to have 100 as my denominator, 20 as my numerator, and most of you know that that is also equivalent or equal to 2/10. Okay? Now, we have another way that we can come up with an equivalent fraction. For example, if we have 6/10, as I do here, if I divide my numerator and my denominator by the same number, so I've got a 2 and a 2, I get an equivalent fraction to 6/10, which gives me this 3/5. Okay? I can also multiply, like we did in a previous lesson. With this fraction, I have 6/10. I'm going to multiply the numerator by 10 and the denominator by 10, and I get 60/100ths, and that would be an equivalent fraction for 6/10. I'm going to move this out of the way. So if I have 8/10, what decimal would that be? Hopefully you are saying it's 0 and 8/10. And if I give you 57/100ths and I ask you what decimal would that be, hopefully you are thinking 0 and 57/100ths. Okay? So we have done several things with this lesson. Mostly we used base 10 blocks to determine fractions and decimals. We converted fractions to decimals. We converted decimals to fractions. And we found equivalent fractions by multiplying or dividing the numerator and denominator by the same number. Thank you for watching.